I'm assuming that folks that tuned in to listen to me today are at different stages of a grant writing process. And some of you might be elbow deep in going for the next cycle of NIH submission, which is January 5th, while others are simply thinking about taking the very first steps towards funding their idea or technology or a device. And so regardless of where you are in this grant writing process, what I'd like to talk to you about today is how to build a framework around your ideas with respect to funding and grant writing using Lean Model Canvas, a platform originally developed for startup entrepreneurs, but is now actually being used by National Science Foundation to in their iCorps program as a way to teach academic scientists how to commercialize their invention. And after I introduced this one-page Lean Model Canvas, which essentially is a way to distill your proposal into most essential parts, and this canvas also allows you to evaluate different ideas and change directions. I will demonstrate how to use this Lean Model Canvas and translate it into a specific aims page. And what I hope you get out of the seminar today is that you will be able to come up with the framework around which you'll be able to put together either a specific aims page or letter of intent for a private foundation or any type of an executive summary that you need to do. So let's agree on the fact that essentially writing a great grant proposal or designing a transformative project is hard work, and actually many issues need to be considered. So what great grants do is they provide solutions to the really important problem. And what makes them great is that they clearly articulate and convince the target audience why the problem is important and why your solution is great. And today, whether you're an academic lab trying to think about putting together your R1, or you're a startup trying to go commercialize your technology through the NIH Small Business Initiative, anywhere you are within the life science ecosystem, you will need to develop a way to raise undiluted funding around your ideas and technologies. Ultimately, part of your success of the venture depends on how effective you are at convincing others that what you're proposing to do is important. So, what's Lean Model Canvas? Lean Model Canvas was put together by Ash Maurya and he specifically adapted it for the environment of the startup. However, the model itself was adapted from previous work, more generic business model canvas. The idea behind business model canvas is that you're able to put together a single page document with 8 sections, and this document will allow you to visualize your entire business plan, or I will argue later, your proposal holistically, such that you can very easily change the ideas and directions. And so the main principle behind the Lean Model Canvas is to be able to reiterate ideas within a single page without having to write long proposal or a business plan, right? And so the key principles here are the ease with which you would complete these sections. Also, the fact that the canvas is designed such that it immediately illuminates all of the high risk elements of your venture while giving you essentially actionable resources to how to go about improving your business. So what are these elements in the context of a startup? You clearly, in a single sentence, you need to state the problem that you're solving. What is the ultimate reason for the business? Ultimate reason for the business to exist? Clearly, you need to have a solution to that problem. So each problem you define in a single sentence in section 1. In a single sentence, define its solution. And of course, the solution is the heart of the product, and it's to be offered by a given startup. Key matrix. Key matrix refers to how you measure the success of your solution. So key matrix reflects the well-being and the health of your business venture in this case. What I find to be the really significant and really important bit in this canvas is the relationship between the value proposition and the customer segments. So what does that mean? It means that you need to propose a very unique value with the solution that you're making. And how is it unique? For that, you need to identify your markets. So you need to understand who is your customer. In case of the research proposal, you will need to understand who is your audience and what value does your solution bring to that market. That fit is critical for a success of any proposal or any business venture. Another parameter is unfair advantage, and that essentially refers to a maturity of a startup as it begins to go through several cycles of undiluted funding and crystallizing their ideas and their mission. And of course, the two other components are the cost structure and the revenue streams. In other words, what's it going to cost for a startup to provide its solution? And what are the ways, while they're providing the solution, they can maintain or sustain their business? Now let's take a look at the way that your grant proposals get scored by the NIH. You get scored on 5 distinct elements, and they're very, very similar to the 8 elements introduced in Lean Canvas. Significance. Is the work important? Now, this is a really critical element, and that element is essentially a combination of what your proposal is offering against the people that you're offering it to. So it is of critical importance that what you're proposing to do is in alignment with an NIH institute or the foundation or a venture capitalist portfolio that you're trying to the mechanism of funding that you're applying for. The second element is innovation. Is it new thinking? Is it changing the paradigm? What is it that you are thinking about that will propel the field forward? Okay, so what is your solution and how innovative is it? Approach. Yes, they're looking for innovation and significance, but they're also looking to see that you've counted all your chickens and you know that what you're proposing to do is feasible. You've thought about potential fallbacks and you know how to address them. The fourth is investigator. So here I cannot overemphasize how important it is that the expertise and the team you put together is actually suited to do the work that you're proposing to do. So here, your expertise and the letter of collaborations that will go together with your proposal are really important. And lastly, the environment. Your institutional support, where you're at. Is there an adequate support and resources for you to be able to do the work that you're proposing to do? So these 5 elements, you can then apply and make this lean model canvas and put it and apply it to how to write research grants. First, define the problem that your grant proposal is trying to solve. In other words, what is the unmet medical need? What is the gap in knowledge? Clearly state in a single sentence, what is your solution to the problem? and what is novel about your solution, whether there is a paradigm shift, the shift in thinking, the new technology, or what. And then again, the really, really important element is the value proposition. What value does your solution provide and to whom? And here I emphasize the relationship between the solution that you're proposing, what you're pitching in your proposal, uh, to the target audience or the institute that will, the institute or the found or the organization that will fund your proposal. You need to identify a group, an organization, an institute, an NIH study section that needs the knowledge that will be generated by your solution, right? And not just that, but who is likely to build upon that knowledge should the work you propose work out. You also need to demonstrate that you're an expert in a field, and you do that by writing what's known, what's unknown, and clearly leading the reviewer to a hypothesis that stands at the foundation of your specific aims. What is it that you have that others don't? That's your unfair advantage. And basically, also within this section would be, how is it that you're advancing the field with these studies? And the two last real important elements are the resources. So say we agree with you, the problem is this, here's your solution, here's what we need to do. Now the question is, what will you need to succeed? And do you have what you need to succeed? The team, the expertise, and the environment. And last but not least is the potential impact of your work. What is the potential impact, new knowledge? How big of an impact are you expecting? If you put together this single model canvas for your research proposal, you will then be able to translate this into specific aims or into an executive summary or into letter of intent. And today I'd like to illustrate how to translate it into a specific aims page. So a specific aims page needs to follow a linear progression of logic for a really strong specific aims section. You need to begin with identifying very clearly either the gap in knowledge, unmet medical need, and how your solution and your goals are matched up with that need and who your audience is. This is a very dynamic process here where you can try to adjust depending who you're writing for. From the objectives, you need to clearly build confidence to make a central hypothesis that you subsequently support with the specific aims and the expected outcomes. And then you iterate that process. And specific aims page, much like an executive summary page, is a living and a breathing document that you refine and iterate as you move on through different elements of your proposal or different your ideas. As long as you find a certain progression within aims and you stand within this 8 pillars of visualizing the entire project, you will be successful. So what I'd like to then do now is to translate this lean model canvas into paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, specific aims page. And I'd like to illustrate my point by examples, because in learning how to write grants and how to approach grants, I ended up reading many other successful grants from other people. And it's only through reading and identifying these different parts in the successful grants that you'd be able to see what I mean to say. So specific aims page can be approached in the sandwich format, where your paragraph 1, you talk about the gap in knowledge, unmet need, goals, and objectives. Paragraph 2, you have to clearly define what is it that you're proposing, how you came to your hypothesis, and the rationale for your specific aims. Paragraph 3 needs to be actual specific aims. So the meat of what you're proposing to do. With the declarative headline sentence, you need to clearly state the objective and the description. So your third paragraph need to start with something like, we will test the hypothesis, we will create a novel design, we will solve a specific problem, challenge an existing paradigm or clinical practice, address a critical barrier to progress in the field, or develop new technology. And then finally, and that depends how you go with the space and how many aims you have, you need to incorporate potentially into the last paragraph or put it together with your aims, potential impact of your work and the innovation. So let's go through different things, paragraph by paragraph. Paragraph 1, on Canvas, it's the problem. What is the unmet medical need, the gap in knowledge your grant proposal is trying to solve? If you're in a life science ecosystem, if you're in the therapeutics, it is what disease you're trying to cure. If you're in medical devices and diagnostics, it is essentially what is the current state, a standard of care, or what is the current solution up against your proposing your solution. Example, in sub-Saharan Africa, co-infection with HIV worsens clinical malaria. That's a statement of a problem. Diabetes is a major health concern in the United States. That's the statement of a problem. Biomarker analysis has emerged as one of the most powerful tools to determine antimicrobial resistance mechanisms. That's the statement of a problem. Address the gap in knowledge or unmet need. Here's an example. There's a critical gap in our knowledge about the impact of HIV on asymptomatic malaria and how HIV may impact the ability of adults to serve as efficient reservoirs of disease. Or management of parasitic diseases depends largely on chemotherapy, but anti-parasitic drug treatments has multiple advantages. So you address it in the very first paragraph after the statement of the problem. So say, what would your first paragraph look like if you are talking about therapeutics? So in the first sentence, epicomplexa are responsible for a number of important human diseases, including malaria, toxoplasmosis, cryptoplasmosis, and so on. That is your statement of the problem. Management of these diseases rests heavily on chemotherapy, but anti-parasitic drug treatment faces multiple challenges. This is the gap in the field, or what needs to be addressed. What about if you're in technologies? Here's a good example. Microscopy has emerged as one of the most powerful and informative ways to analyze cell-based high-throughput screening in experiments designed to uncover novel drugs and drug targets. So that is your statement. But now you present the gap in knowledge where you're hoping to advance. However, many diseases and biological pathways can be better studied in whole animals, particularly diseases that involve organ systems and multicellular interactions. What about an example if you're putting together a commercialization plan? Well, if you are writing an SBIR and your specific aims need to take into consideration not only the statement and the gap unmet medical need, but also you need to know a little bit about your market. So for example, here, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is a chronic, progressive, and fatal fibrotic lung disease, and so on. And here there is a special emphasis on IPF is also an expensive disease with direct treatment costs of around $25,000 per person per year, which is a higher than average cost of breast cancer therapy and many other serious conditions. So in the commercialization plans, your specific aims need to reflect the fact that you have thought about your market, in addition to the problem and the solution. Second paragraph of your specific aims, Define your goal. Here's an example. Our long-term goal is to understand how behavioral modification can prevent the early onset of diabetes. So very broad and single sentence. Or the goal of our research is to determine the mechanism of X, Y, and Z. Or the overarching goal of our research is to define something. So define your goals and objectives, then describe them. A good example, we propose to focus a series of complementary clinical and entomological studies using highly sensitive and specific molecular tools. Or this proposal will focus on testing behavioral interventions in the institutionalized elderly. Or another alternative, we propose to develop artificial intelligence algorithm for the analysis of thought-related changes in cerebral perfusion. So essentially, distilled down to 2 or 3 sentences, describe what your objectives. Define the underlying hypothesis. Here I give example of two different grants. So how do you go from the problem to the solution, so unmet medical need to a solution, and then you lead the reviewer to essentially defining your underlying hypothesis. For example, we hypothesize that HIV itself and the treatment used routinely for opportunistic infection prophylaxis contribute to excess malaria burden, okay? And then propose the mechanism. Or both of these responses are unique to a subset of enterococci exhibiting Van A phenotype, and we hypothesize that they're essential for the pathogenesis of whatever that will be. So clearly define, state what your hypothesis is, and then describe the evidence for the hypothesis. And when you describe the evidence for the hypothesis, think about the value proposition, what your studies, what the knowledge or solution, and who your target audience is. If you're in a position to have preliminary data and you have your own evidence for the hypothesis, by all means, this is the place to put it in. And the sentences need to be broad. For the first time, our published data from macaques support a direct enhancing effect of retrovirus pre-infection on malaria parasite growth, gametocytogenesis, and transmission. Or prior studies conducted by our group have demonstrated novel interactions between unbound phenytonin and coronary endothelial cells. If you don't have your own preliminary data, you need to make sure that you have reviewed your field and you understand your field and you cite appropriate people in the field that to provide the evidence for your hypothesis. Okay, the third paragraph. The third paragraph is the actual specific aims. And here you have a choice whether or not you can add a potential impact and weave it in your specific aims, or you leave that separate. Each specific aim needs to begin with the short declarative descriptive title. Your aims need to be specific, they need to be measurable, realistic, and they also need to be independent of one another. In other words, aims have to be set up in such a way that if one of the aims fail, you're still able to address another aspect of a project completely independently. So I'd like to give some of the examples of what I mean by specific and measurable specific aims. So specific aim 1, to determine the pathogenesis of disease in vivo. Based on our hypothesis, we predict that disruption of the interaction between X, Y, and Z and the ABC receptor will increase resistance to the disease. So it's a very specific statement and the hypothesis. Access, what are we gonna do? Access disease pathogenesis in mice with mutations, and then access disease resistance in mice treated with siRNA. So 2 different aspects of the research that are independent of one another two different bullet points within aim. And then another way to weave in your potential impact into the aim is illustrated in this example. So here, what they've done is they've essentially underneath the aim split it into the challenge, approach, and impact. So this aim is to develop algorithms for C. elegans viability assays to identify modulators of pathogen infection. And then they go in and they put in the hypothesis, they give in their approach, and they put in the impact where they say that these algorithms will quantify a wide range of phenotypic descriptions detectable in individual worms, including body morphology, as well as subtle variation in reporter signal levels. So specific aims need to be independent of one another, as I said. And here in this example, I'd like to illustrate two aims that are independent of one another. Specific aim 1 is a point prevalence of co-infection, while in specific aim 2 is longitudinal prevalence of asymptomatic parasitemia. Both of these address different elements of the project, but independently. So it's essentially two divided problems that have two different but complementary solutions. Your specific aims need to be realistic. And here's an example of what a realistic specific aim may sound like. We want to define determinants of Gardnerella vaginalis virulence using new genetic techniques, and then simply bullet point in single sentence what it boils down to. We will determine the genes required for production. We will construct and evaluate specific strains that with altered specificity, and we will determine the genes required for biofilm formation. So these are all very realistic aims that sound like people know what they're gonna do and they've thought about how long it would take. And lastly, the last paragraph should focus on innovation, impact, and outcome. And that, again, depends how much space you have left in putting together your ideas. You could potentially put in small bits about impact and innovation within the specific aims, and then simply make a last sentence more broad, or you can have another paragraph focusing on the innovation and impact and outcome. And it should sound something like that. To our knowledge, this proposal is the first attempt to use microarray technology to discern differential patterns in human gene activation, right? Or these experiments described in this proposal will provide a complete description of the mechanism. Or understanding the pathogenesis of this disease will lead to new therapeutic approaches. Or this proposal applies to state-of-the-art techniques to understand the pathogenesis. So some final thoughts that I think are applicable to writing a specific aims page, but also applicable to writing an executive summary or a letter of intent. Lay out your aims so clearly that the reviewers understand them without having to read things more than once. Understand that the particularly NIH reviewers are busy men and women that have other obligations, and they're usually given 10 grants to review, and the first thing they come across is a specific aims page. Make it easy for them to read it. Write for general audience. Don't bury your aims in too much jargon and abbreviation. Try your best in the specific aims to pique the reviewer's interest, right? Help them share your enthusiasm for the project, why it's important for the mystery to be solved, and lead the reviewer down this sort of logical trail of ideas that makes the conclusion of what is being proposed to be done as inescapable, right? So for that, you can use quotation from the NIH director or specific strategic plans, from different institutes. This is where you have to make sure that you are matched up between your value proposition and your target audience. Convince the reviewers that the funding will be a good return on investment. Explain specialized terminology. Don't write too dense, because too dense to read, too dense to find. And most important thing, keep it interesting, right? It's great to read a fantastic grant proposal. Make it easy for people to understand. All right, so I will end here. And if you're interested in our grant writing services or consulting, please email Science Docs, and I'll take any questions you may have.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Lubman. So if you have any questions for her, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section or throw them in the chat and I'll read them out to her. So one of the attendees commented, he said you kind of talked about undiluted funding, and he was kind of asking if you could, I guess, expand more on the value of undiluted funding and also the value of a grant in giving potential investors the comfort that your proposal is scientifically vetted.
Right. So I think that okay. So my understanding of the question is how to bring in whether or not your proposal has been basically evaluated by scientists and had already seen some sort of evaluation. And I think before people go into the NIH proposals, depending on your environment, you should try for either small foundation grants or small internal sources of undiluted funding that focus on proof of concept idea. So essentially, uh, find the experiment that works and do it over and over kind of idea. So there are ample resources, especially in and around innovation hubs, that offer enough funding to for the initial proof of concept experiment, which is undiluted funding. With that money, you can then go for an SBIR, which is an undiluted funding source, or you could potentially go to letter of intent towards private foundation, depending where you are.
We had another question come in. How would someone approach to write the specific aims page if for a platform technology that may have multiple applications and markets?
That's actually kind of great. So what I would do is I would put together lean model canvas for each application separately, because in the process of doing it, you will vet what you should focus on. Go for the low hanging fruit first, right? So go for a situation where you fill out this lean model canvas and it immediately makes sense. Go for that application first. I also think that once you're within one application and you've been able to show proof of concept, you can then expand on your intellectual property and to include other applications, or you can start off really broadly and then basically demonstrate proof of concept on one single application and then consider others.
So for people who are thinking about writing a commercialization plan, should they include intellectual property in that specific games page?
Right. So I think that it's really important for people that are aiming to commercialize either the devices or their technology or their diagnostic, that they write in the specific aims page exactly where they are with respect to intellectual property, particularly because different institutions deal with their Office of Technology Management differently. And so depending where you are in the patent process, I think can really make a difference in the commercialization plan.
So how, I guess, would a startup or someone trying to develop the technology go about to finding the right NIH audience for their science?
Right. So I think what would be really what is a really good way of going about looking for similar projects or who would be the right audience for your work is to go to the NIH reporters matchmaking website. And I have a slide there that shows you that matchmaking function. Do you think we can maybe share that? Oh no,
Uh,
you don't have that. Let me do that. One
sure.
sec. Okay. So NIH actually has a project reporter, which is a really great database that you can search in all sorts of different ways. One particular feature that I think is really great is called Matchmaker. If you go into a Matchmaker and simply put in your abstract, right, or some sort of a 4 or 5 sentence summary of what you're working on, it will search the entire NIH database to come up with projects that either are currently being funded or have been previously funded within that space. And you can also, once you do that, you can also then tell which institute funds these proposals. And so you can then look at the strategic plan of that institute and aim your proposal at that institute.
We had another question come in. Do you know of any references that explain different sources for non-dilutive funding and how to make those decisions?
I would go to the NSF I-Corps program. And so this is actually a conscientious effort by National Science Foundation to help academic scientists to commercialize and think about their inventions. And I think if you go through that program, you will begin to understand how to set up the diluted and undiluted funding with respect to the NIH. So basically, they provide some of the background on in the so, in the first in the phase one of your SBIR grant, you need to be undiluted because if it's diluted, then basically you have no revenue stream of any kind. So undiluted funding needs to go on until you're able to support somehow your return on investment, right? And there are ways to do this systematically. You can start with small internal grants to show proof of concept. From there on, you can go for larger sums of money that will now cover not only the science, but also the salaries. And once you're at that stage with the proper intellectual property protection, that's your that's your end game, right? And so there are available sort of money routes to take where you don't have to be poor in order to have a startup, right? You can still do it with your job attached.
Thank you. Um, so when a company is creating the specific aim page, should they include visuals in their page, like figures, diagrams, or like tables?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about it at all because it would be really difficult to bring up an examples of visual. But if you can visualize your project, if there is a really good visual you could put in, I would definitely choose that and sacrifice some of the verbiage because the most important thing to get out of specific aims is how easy it should be to read and understand, right? But if you are not able to have a figure that encapsulates it all, if it's just simply for aesthetics or to fill up the space, then I would skip the figure.
I'm not seeing any other new questions coming in, but did you want to give any last remarks or advice for these attendees?
Um, no, I mean, I think that it's good to have your specific aims looked at by as many people as possible. I know that sometimes you're bound by intellectual property, but you can simply sign a non-disclosure agreement and have folks have another pair of eyes look at your text. It is always great to have that because you're able to see problems. So I encourage people to do that.